There was a moment in the life of Napoleon Bonaparte when everything seemed to be in his hands. France had become more stable after the chaotic years of the Revolution. The law had been reorganized, the army acclaimed him. The people looked to him as the man who had brought order back, and the royal courts of Europe began to tremble at the name Napoleon. But from that very height, tragedy also began. The man who had once acted in the name of the French Revolution to open the way for a new France would, in the end, place the crown upon his own head at Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris. The man who had built the civil code to bring order to society would also be the man who drew millions of lives into wars without end. The man who once made Europe bow after Austerlitz and Tilsit would finally have to watch his Grande Armée disintegrate amid the white snow of Russia. This video is a journey into the most brilliant, but also the most dangerous period of Napoleon's life. From reformer to emperor, from the glory of Austerlitz to the rupture in Spain, from the crown in Paris to the freezing retreat of 1812. Because there are people who do not collapse when they are at their weakest. They begin to collapse when they become so powerful that they believe they cannot be wrong, and Napoleon, perhaps, had reached precisely that moment. When Napoleon became first consul, France did not merely need another victory. After many years of revolution, executions, civil war, financial crisis, and political suspicion, what the people longed for more deeply was a life that could be predicted. They needed to know whether money would still have value tomorrow, what system their children would be educated in, whether the church would remain a place of prayer, or continue to be a wound between faith and the state, and whether the law would still change according to the anger of the times. For Napoleon, that was the new battlefield. It was no longer only the place where cannons fired across valleys, but the place where a fractured nation had to be put back together piece by piece. He understood very clearly that power based only on military glory could not last. A general could excite the people on the day of victory, but a ruler had to make life function during ordinary days. And so Napoleon began to pour the energy he had once devoted to the battlefield into the machinery of the state. He wanted a France with a strong central authority, clear administration, stable finances, education in service of the nation, religion controlled but not abolished, and laws unified enough that the people would no longer have to live among the overlapping legal fragments of the past. In 1800, the Bank of France was established. Behind that seemingly dry financial institution lay the very ordinary need of a country that had just passed through upheaval. The need to restore confidence in money, credit, and economic activity. A revolution may open the door to great ideals, but if trade is disordered, if the treasury is unstable, the people still pay the price in their meals, in their work, and in the insecurity of every family. Napoleon was not a thinker sitting down to write abstract dreams. He was a practical man. He knew that a strong nation had to have a financial foundation firm enough to sustain the army, pay civil servants, and keep the administrative machine from paralysis. The question of religion was also a deep wound. The French Revolution had severely ruptured the relationship between the state and the Catholic Church. Many believers felt that their faith had been insulted. Many revolutionaries, meanwhile, saw the church as part of the old order that had to be controlled. If that rupture were allowed to continue, France could hardly remain stable. In 1801, Napoleon signed the Concordat with Pope Pius VII. This agreement did not return France to the time when the church dominated the state, but neither did it continue to push religion to the margins of social life. The state recognized Catholicism as the religion of the majority of the French people, while the government still retained important control over the appointment and organization of the church in France. Here, Napoleon's political instinct can be seen very clearly. He did not reconcile purely out of softness of heart. He reconciled because he understood that a nation divided in its soul would be very difficult to govern by laws alone. People may obey the government out of fear, but for a country to be truly stable, they need to feel that the things they hold sacred are not being trampled upon. The Concordat, therefore, was not merely a religious document. It was a political bridge, reconnecting in part the relationship between the revolutionary state and the people who still lived by the old faith. Education was also placed by Napoleon at the center of his work of state building. In 1802, the system of secondary schools known as lycées was established to train young men to serve the administrative and military machinery. For Napoleon, school was not merely a place to transmit knowledge. It was where the state created disciplined citizens, capable officials, obedient officers, and people shaped within a common order. If he himself had once been an outsider boy passing through the military schools of France, he now understood the power of education in forming an entire generation loyal to the nation and to central authority. But Napoleon's greatest legacy in this period was the Civil Code. On the 21st of March, 1804, the French Civil Code was promulgated. In form, it was a legal document. In historical depth, it was an effort to move France from a state of fragmented law into a unified order. Before that, French laws still bore many traces of regional differences, old customs, feudal privileges, and layers of accumulated history. The new code established important principles such as property rights, civil equality before the law for male citizens, freedom of contract, family order, and the secular character of the state. That code was not perfect when viewed through the eyes of today. It still placed women in a position subordinate to men, strengthened the authority of the father within the family, and carried many of the limitations of its age. Yet when placed within the context of a France that had only just emerged from the Revolution, it becomes easier to understand why it endured for so long. It brought clarity. It made the law less dependent upon old privileges. It gave people the sense that there was a common foundation upon which they could rely, regardless of where they lived or what social class they belonged to. Many of Napoleon's later victories would fade away, and many of the territories he conquered would slip from French hands, but the Civil Code would continue to influence France and many legal traditions around the world. There is something deeply worth reflecting upon here. Napoleon became famous for his speed on the battlefield, yet in the work of reform, he left his mark through patient organization. He wanted everything in formation: the army in formation, civil servants in formation, schools in formation, laws in formation, and even religion itself assigned a place within the order of the state. That was his strength, but it was also his limitation. For a man who believes too strongly in the order he has created can easily come to think that society, Europe, and even history itself can be arranged like a marching formation. During the consulate years, Napoleon gave France exactly what its exhausted people needed: stability, law, institutions, and the feeling that the nation was being guided by a strong hand. Yet the more that hand accomplished, the harder it became to accept remaining merely the head of a republic. When a man becomes accustomed to making laws for society, arranging institutions, and being seen by the people as the savior of order, another question begins to emerge quietly. Would such power still be content to wear the modest garment of a consul, or would it seek a symbol greater, more dazzling, and more dangerous, the crown? After years spent establishing order, Napoleon was no longer the young general standing outside the gates of power. He stood at the center of France, directing the machinery of the state with a forceful will and a rare practical vision. People exhausted by chaos saw him as the man who had restored stability. The army saw him as the path to glory. The new administrative elite found in him a center of authority strong enough to keep France from falling back into the old spiral of disorder. In such an atmosphere, the question was no longer whether Napoleon possessed power. The real question was what name that power would ultimately bear. In 1804, plots against Napoleon, particularly from royalist circles, deepened his obsession with stability. The arrest and execution of the Duke of Enghien that year cast a dark shadow across his rise. It revealed that Napoleon was not content merely to protect his government through law and prestige. He was also willing to employ harsh measures whenever he felt his throne threatened. Out of fear of assassination, out of the desire to prevent the return of the House of Bourbon, and out of the need to create a clear system of succession, the idea of transforming the power of the first consul into the power of an emperor gradually became legitimized. On the 18th of May, 1804, The French Senate proclaimed Napoleon Emperor of the French. The title sounded like an echo from the monarchical past, yet it was clothed in the language of a new age, not to abolish the Republic, but to protect the achievements of the Revolution from chaos and from a Bourbon restoration. It is here that history produced an almost painful paradox. The Revolution had overthrown the throne, sent King Louis XVI to the guillotine, and proclaimed a new order founded upon citizens and law. Yet little more than a decade later, France stood before a coronation ceremony complete with crown, ritual, pope, and all the symbols of supreme power concentrated in a single man. On the 2nd of December, 1804, at Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris, the coronation took place in the presence of Pope Pius VII. The setting was rich with symbolism. The soaring cathedral vaults, magnificent ceremonial robes, the watchful eyes of courtiers, generals, politicians, and people who had lived through the revolution and now witnessed the birth of a new dynasty. Napoleon did not allow the Pope to place the crown upon his head in the traditional manner. He crowned himself, then placed the imperial crown upon Josephine. That moment spoke more loudly than any declaration. It revealed that Napoleon desired recognition from religion and ceremony, but did not wish his authority to appear as though it had been granted by anyone else. He wanted both France and Europe to understand that the crown was something he had seized with his own hands. It was a magnificent spectacle, yet beneath the gold and splendor lay a silent question. Was the man wearing that crown the heir of the revolution, or the one who had brought it to an end? To his supporters, Napoleon had not betrayed the ideals of 1789. He had merely placed those ideals within a form of government strong enough to survive. To those who felt disappointed, the coronation was proof that the revolution had traveled a very long road only to return to the image of one man standing above all others. The difference was that this new emperor had not been born into an ancient dynasty. He had risen from the battlefield, from chaos, from his own talent and ambition. Not everyone could accept such a transformation. Ludwig van Beethoven, who had once admired Napoleon as a symbol of freedom and of a new kind of man, became deeply disappointed when he saw him become emperor. The story of Beethoven removing his dedication to Napoleon from his symphony is often recalled as a symbolic act of the spirit. In the eyes of many contemporaries, the moment Napoleon placed the crown upon his own head was not merely a political ceremony, it was the breaking of a belief. The hero of the revolution had now begun to resemble an emperor. Yet it would be far too simple to describe Napoleon merely as a betrayer of the revolution. He did not restore the old regime in its entirety. He did not return France to the feudal aristocracy. His empire rested upon the army, administration, law, talent, and service to the state far more than upon inherited bloodlines. He created a new kind of monarchy, one that inherited the rituals of the past while operating through the modern machinery opened by the revolution. It was precisely this combination that made Napoleon so unique and so difficult to judge. He was a son of the revolution, yet he was also the man who placed the revolution under his command. On the 26th of May, 1805, at Milan Cathedral, Napoleon was crowned King of Italy with the Iron Crown of Lombardy. That image revealed that his ambition no longer fit within the borders of France. From Paris to Milan, from the title of Emperor of the French to King of Italy, Napoleon was constructing a European order centered upon himself. Each new crown was not merely a symbol of glory. It was also a challenge directed at the old royal courts. Your age may no longer belong to you. The coronation, therefore, became one of the most magnificent and most dangerous moments in Napoleon's life. Magnificent because it condensed the extraordinary journey of a man who had risen from the island of Corsica to the summit of power. Dangerous because it marked the moment when personal ambition became wrapped in the aura of destiny. When a man becomes confident enough to believe that he can place a crown upon his own head, he may also begin to believe that he can reshape all of Europe by the same force of will. And after that crown, war was no longer simply the struggle of revolutionary France against monarchical coalitions. It became a confrontation between a rising empire and an old Europe struggling to defend itself. Napoleon's military zenith was approaching rapidly, brilliant as the sun rising through the mist. Yet that very light was already beginning to draw the shadows closer. After the coronation, Napoleon was no longer merely the general of a republic or the first consul of a France seeking to recover order. He had become emperor. That title changed the way Europe viewed him, and it also changed the way he viewed himself. From this point onward, each campaign was no longer simply a battle to defend France. It took on the character of a contest between a new empire ascending and old dynasties fearful of being swept from their positions. Across the map of Europe, borders began to tremble before the march of the Grande Armée. Britain, Napoleon's most persistent rival, remained the greatest obstacle in all his calculations. Since 1803, war between Britain and France had resumed. Napoleon had prepared camps at Boulogne-sur-Mer with the intention of invading Britain, but the sea was not a battlefield he could command as he commanded the plains of Europe. The Royal Navy remained an almost insurmountable barrier. At the same time, Britain persuaded Austria and Russia to join the Third Coalition against France. In a remarkably short period, the dream of crossing the Channel gave way to a continental campaign of such scale and speed that it astonished all of Europe. Napoleon changed direction with extraordinary speed. The Grande Armée was ordered to march eastward from the Boulogne region. This was not a scattered movement, but a vast war machine operating according to the will of a single man. He did not wait for his enemies to strike first. He pulled the war into his own rhythm, forcing his opponents to react from a position of delay. In October of 1805, during the Ulm campaign, French forces surrounded the Austrian army and compelled its surrender. On the 20th of October, 1805, tens of thousands of Austrian soldiers were captured. It was an almost perfect victory of maneuver, in which Napoleon defeated his enemy not merely with weapons, but with speed and surprise. Only one day later, on the 21st of October, 1805, the combined French and Spanish fleet was defeated by the British fleet at Trafalgar. At sea, Napoleon could not defeat Britain. On land, he remained a commander whom almost no one could match. That contrast created one of the great paradoxes of his life, an emperor capable of shaking the capitals of Europe, yet still held back by British sails and the waves of the sea. Napoleon's glory, therefore, always had a limit somewhere on the horizon. On the 2nd of December, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation, Napoleon entered the Battle of Austerlitz. It became one of the most brilliant moments of his military career. Facing the combined Austrian and Russian armies, Napoleon relied not only on strength, but also on patience, strategy, and his remarkable ability to read the psychology of his opponents. He allowed the enemy to believe that his right flank was weak, lured them away from their favorable positions, and then launched a decisive blow against their center. On the Pratzen Heights, the balance of the battle shifted. The Allied armies were shattered. A battle remembered as the Battle of the Three Emperors ended in a resounding victory for the youngest emperor on the field. Austerlitz was not merely a victory for France. It was the moment when Napoleon touched a form of glory that seemed almost unreal. After the battle, the Third Coalition collapsed. Austria was forced to sign the Treaty of Pressburg at the end of December, 1805. The old order of Central Europe was profoundly shaken. Less than a year later, the Holy Roman Empire, a political structure that had existed for centuries, came to an end. For Napoleon, Austerlitz appeared to be proof that his will could bend history itself. For the dynasties of Europe, it was a warning that the man who had crowned himself in Paris was not a passing symbol, but a force capable of redrawing the map. After Austerlitz, Napoleon returned home amid thunderous acclaim. Yet those very cheers were beginning to become dangerous. Some victories make a man more humble because they reveal how fragile fate can be. Other victories persuade a man that fate itself stands at his side. For Napoleon, Austerlitz belonged to the second category. From that point onward, he no longer believed merely in his own talent. He began to believe that he had the right to reorder Europe according to a new design, one in which thrones, alliances, and smaller states could all be adjusted according to the will of Paris. In 1806, the Fourth Coalition was formed. Prussia entered the war with the pride of an old military power, but that pride was quickly crushed. On the 14th of October, 1806, in the two battles of Jena and Austerlitz, the Prussian army suffered a devastating defeat. Napoleon entered Berlin. Once again, Europe witnessed a kingdom once considered powerful being struck down with astonishing speed. The French armies did not merely occupy territory. They carried with them a message. The age of war had changed, and those who still believed in old glory could be awakened by the sound of cannon fire. But to the east, Russia still remained. After bloody clashes in the harsh winter, Napoleon continued to seek a decisive victory. On the 14th of June, 1807, at Friedland, he defeated the Russian army. That victory opened the way to the Treaty of Tilsit. In July of 1807, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. The image carried powerful symbolism. Two young monarchs standing between the waters, dividing influence over the continent, while the rest of Europe held its breath and watched. Tilsit was the height of Napoleon's diplomatic power. Prussia was severely reduced in territory. The Duchy of Warsaw was created in the Polish lands controlled by France. The German states were rearranged within his sphere of influence. Members of the Bonaparte family were placed, one after another, upon the thrones of Europe. This new order displayed Napoleon's talent for political organization, but it also revealed a very clear dynastic instinct. He did not merely want France to be strong. He wanted all of Europe to revolve around the Bonaparte family. In those years, Napoleon seemed to be standing on the summit of a very high mountain. Looking down, he saw his armies pass through capital after capital. Looking into the distance, he saw royal courts forced to negotiate, to concede, and to calculate according to the rhythm he had created. But every summit has thin air. The higher one rises, the harder it becomes to hear the warning voices from below. Victory after victory made it easy for Napoleon to believe that every problem could be solved by speed, discipline, willpower, and one decisive battle. That was the beauty and also the seed of tragedy in this period. Austerlitz turned Napoleon into a legend. Jena made his enemies tremble. Friedland brought him to Tilsit, where his power seemed to reach its highest limit. But precisely when a man believes he holds Europe in his hands, he begins to forget that nations are not motionless chess pieces, lands are not merely colors on a map, and the hearts of people cannot be ruled forever by victory. From the summit of Tilsit, the road ahead no longer led Napoleon only toward glory. It began to lead him into lands more difficult to subdue, where resistance no longer stood in formation for him to defeat in a single day. Spain would show him the strength of a people who felt insulted. Russia would show him that distance, winter, and exhaustion could defeat even genius. And from those very cracks, the empire that had seemed unshakable would begin to hear the first sound of fracture. After Tilsit, Napoleon stood in a position that very few people in history had ever reached. From Paris, he could arrange thrones, redistribute territories, and force dynasties to calculate according to his stride. But the wider power becomes, the more easily it touches lands that maps cannot fully explain. A country is not only a border. A people is not only a population. A homeland cannot be subdued simply because the victor has signed a treaty or placed a relative upon its throne. That was the lesson Napoleon would have to learn at a very costly price in Spain. In 1807, because Portugal refused to comply with the continental system designed to blockade trade with Britain, Napoleon sent troops into the Iberian Peninsula with the initial cooperation of Spain. On the surface, the goal was to put pressure on Portugal, Britain's long-standing ally. But very quickly, the French military presence moved beyond an ordinary campaign. Napoleon intervened deeply in Spain, forced King Charles IV and Prince Ferdinand from power, and then placed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne in 1808. On paper, this may have looked like a political arrangement. In the hearts of the Spanish people, it was an insult. On the 2nd of May, 1808, the Dos de Mayo uprising erupted in Madrid. The people did not rise up because of a perfect military plan. They rose because they felt trampled upon, because the throne of their country had been turned into a family reward for a foreign emperor, and because French soldiers stood in the capital like the new masters of their homeland. The uprising was bloodily suppressed, but the blood spilled on the streets of Madrid caused the flame of resistance to spread. From that point onward, Spain was no longer a courtly problem. It became a war of the people's heart. In Spain, Napoleon encountered a kind of war that he could not solve with one decisive battle. The French army could defeat regular forces, occupy cities, and control main roads, but it could not force every village, every parish, and every guerrilla band to accept Joseph as a legitimate king. Guerrilla warfare wore down French strength day by day. Supply convoys were ambushed, small units were cut off, and soldiers lived constantly with the feeling that they never knew where the enemy would appear from. This was not an open battlefield on which Napoleon could arrange his forces as he had done at Austerlitz. It was a bleeding wound. The more it was bandaged, the more it hurt. The longer it lasted, the more it exhausted the empire. Napoleon personally went to Spain, defeated the Spanish armies, retook Madrid, and pushed back the British forces under the command of John Moore. But he could not remain there forever. Once he departed, the war continued. The British, under Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, gradually transformed the Iberian Peninsula into a persistent front against France. For Napoleon, Spain was a mistake, not merely because it drained manpower. It was even more dangerous because it exposed the limits of the Bonaparte imperial model. Not every place could be governed by a king appointed by him, and not every people would accept being placed within a new order simply because that order appeared efficient on paper. Napoleon himself would later regard the war in Spain as one of the great disasters of his career. It cost him soldiers, time, prestige, and revealed to his enemies that the French Empire was not invulnerable. If Austerlitz created the legend of genius, Spain began to wear that legend down through countless small cuts, quiet, relentless, and unceasing. An empire may survive a major defeat, but it is difficult to remain secure when a new wound opens behind its back every single day. While the wound in Spain remained unhealed, relations between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I grew steadily worse. After Tilsit, the two men had stood side by side like powerful rulers sharing influence across the continent. But the interests of France and Russia could not remain aligned for long. The continental system damaged the Russian economy. The question of Poland alarmed the Russian aristocracy. Suspicion deepened, and by 1812, Napoleon made the boldest and also the most dangerous decision of his life, to lead the Grand Armée into Russia. At the end of June 1812, the invasion of Russia began. Napoleon's armies crossed the Niemen River and entered the vast expanse of the Russian Empire. The force he assembled was enormous, commonly known as the Grande Armée, composed of soldiers from France and from many allied and satellite states within the imperial system. He expected to force the Russians into a decisive battle, defeat them swiftly, and compel Alexander to negotiate. It was the method that had brought him success so many times across Europe. But Russia refused to fight according to his rhythm. The Russian armies retreated deep into the interior, leaving behind distance, poor roads, shortages of food, and lands devastated by scorched earth tactics. The farther he advanced, the more elusive victory became. The French captured territory, but they could not grasp an ending. They marched along endless roads through deserted villages, past burned supply depots, and through the heavy silence of a country that refused to grant Napoleon the battle he desired. On the 7th of September, 1812, the Battle of Borodino took place near Moscow. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the age. The French won a tactical victory, but the Russian army was not destroyed. It withdrew in good order, still capable of resistance, while Napoleon was forced to continue forward into an even greater void. When Napoleon entered Moscow, he believed that the capture of the city would force the Tsar to seek peace. But Moscow did not grant him that victory. The city burned. The flames consumed the hope of turning military success into peace. Napoleon remained and waited, but Alexander did not come to the negotiating table. An emperor accustomed to deciding the fate of others through speed now found himself confronted by what he feared most: the silence of his opponent and the passage of time beyond his control. When the retreat began, the true tragedy unfolded. The Grande Armée, which had entered Russia with the confidence of the undefeated, was now struck by hunger, cold, exhaustion, disease, pursuit, frozen roads, and the collapse of morale. The soldiers no longer thought about glory. They thought about a piece of bread, a scrap of clothing, a place to sleep through the night, and a chance to survive and return home. In November of 1812, the crossing of the Berezina River became the painful symbol of the campaign. Part of the army escaped, but the cost was terrible. From an expedition intended to subdue Russia, Napoleon returned with an army that had been shattered. Spain and Russia struck Napoleon in two very different ways. Spain proved that a people whose pride and identity had been insulted could transform an entire country into a battlefield. Russia proved that space, logistics, winter, and a strategy of relentless retreat could drain the strength of even a military genius. In both places, Napoleon did not fail because he lacked intelligence. He failed because he believed that the methods that had carried him to the summit could be applied to every land, every people, and every circumstance. After 1812, the legend of Napoleon's invincibility was no longer intact. The dynasties of Europe saw an opportunity. Those who had once feared him began to understand that the French emperor could also be exhausted and worn down. The empire still existed, the army still existed, and Napoleon's will had not yet broken, but the sound of fracture was now clearer than ever before. From the snowy fields of Russia, his road would lead to Leipzig, Fontainebleau, and a painful farewell to the very army that had once shouted his name in triumph. After Russia, Napoleon was still alive. He still possessed a throne. He still possessed his will. But one thing had been lost forever: the belief that he was a man who could never be defeated. From those snowy fields, all of Europe began to understand that the French emperor could fall. And when fear turned into opportunity, the enemies who had once bowed before him would rise together against him.